What would you do if the map everyone said led nowhere turned out to lead exactly where it needed to go? There is a lake in the boreal north of Ontario that doesn't appear on any road sign. The locals call it Shepherd's Hollow, though you won't find that name on any provincial survey. The water is dark and cold and still, the kind of still that makes you feel as though the lake is listening. For 60 years, people in the nearest town whispered about what was beneath that water: a boat, a chest, a secret that a dead man had carried to the bottom and never let go. Most people decided it was a campfire story, the kind you tell to keep children close to the fire and away from the dark. But the truth was never at the bottom of the lake. It was waiting on the shore, and it was waiting for the right kind of woman to find it. We want to tell you her story. Stay close. Hazel Ingram arrived in the village of Dunmore Creek in the first week of October, when the maples had already turned and the birches were letting go of their leaves one by one, like a slow, reluctant surrender. She came on the bus from Sudbury, which was the cheapest way, and she carried everything she owned in a canvas pack on her back and a battered leather satchel in her right hand. The satchel was heavy. Inside it, wrapped in a piece of old flannel, was a drawknife, a curved, two-handled tool used for shaping and stripping wood that had belonged to her teacher, a man named Douglas Fenwick, who had died of a quiet, ordinary heart attack in April and left her with nothing except the tool and the knowledge of how to use it. She was 22 years old. She had no family she could call on, no savings worth counting. The room she had rented in Sudbury had been taken from her the week after Douglas passed, because it was his name on the lease, not hers, and the landlord had not been unkind about it, just efficient. She had spent 3 weeks on a cousin's couch before understanding that she was not wanted there either, and so she had spread a provincial road map on the kitchen table one night after everyone else was asleep, closed her eyes, and let her finger fall. Dunmore Creek, population according to the map's legend, 3 in 40, small enough that a person might be left alone, close enough to the shield that there would be work for someone who knew wood. She had learned the trade from Douglas Fenwick, who had run a small custom furniture workshop out of a converted barn on the edge of Elliott Lake for 30 years. He had taken her on at 17 when she showed up at his door looking for any kind of work, and within a month he had recognized what she had: an instinct for grain and geometry, a patience with her hands that most people never develop at any age. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a thorough one, and he taught her everything he knew: how to read wood the way other people read faces, how to feel for the flaw inside a plank before it split, how to use the drawknife with the steady drawing pull that gave the tool its name. He had never once told her she was good at it, but he had given her the drawknife when she turned 20, handing it across the workbench without ceremony, saying, "Only, you'll need this more than I will eventually." She hadn't known that eventually would come so soon. Dunmore Creek was the kind of town that has been overlooking itself for decades. The main street had a feed store, a hardware, a small grocery, a diner called Evelyn's, and a Legion Hall that doubled as the community center on weekends. There was a sawmill at the edge of town that still ran, which was more than most small Ontario towns could say. The lake, Shepherd's Hollow, lay 3 kilometers to the north, accessible by a gravel road that turned to mud in the rain. Hazel found a room above the hardware store, rented by the week to whoever needed it. The owner, Gerald Hesp, was a narrow man in his 60s who smelled of machine oil and looked at her with the mild, assessing suspicion that small towns reserve for newcomers. She paid for 2 weeks up front with most of what she had left. The room had a single window facing east, a wood stove, and a cot. It was enough. She did not ask for comfort. She asked only for a place to put her tools and her hands to work. She found the sawmill willing to take her on for piecework, sanding, finishing, the tasks nobody else wanted. It was not what Douglas had trained her for, but it kept her eating. She worked quietly, and she worked well, and after a week the mill foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Calvin Dray, stopped watching her with skepticism and started watching her with something closer to respect. He was not the kind of man to say so out loud. He simply began giving her better work. The townspeople watched her, the way all small towns watch newcomers. From the edges, through windows, in the lulls between conversations. They saw the young woman with the dark circles under her eyes, and the careful, methodical way she moved, as if she was always thinking 2 steps ahead. They saw the way she ate alone at Evelyn's diner, reading whatever paperback she could find at the library. They saw the leather satchel she carried everywhere. They did not know what to make of her. She was not unfriendly, but she was not open. She smiled when smiled at. She answered questions with other questions. She stayed inside herself. What they didn't know was that she was listening. She was always listening. It was in the second week, at Evelyn's diner over a bowl of soup, that she first heard the name Shepherd's Hollow spoken in a particular tone, low and sideways, the tone people use for things they believe and don't want to admit to believing. Two older men at the next table. The one with the gray beard was talking about the storm that had come through the week before Hazel arrived. Blew half the dock off Cartwright's camp, he said. And old Marilyn Spall says the waterline dropped 2 feet overnight. Says she could see the shape of something on the north shore that wasn't there before. Something dark. The other man, thinner, with the careful stillness of a man who had survived many seasons, said nothing for a moment. Then, you know what that lake holds. The first man snorted. I know what people say it holds. 60 years is a long time for a story to stay exactly the same. They went quiet after that, the way people do when they realize they are being overheard. Hazel finished her soup. She did not ask questions. She went back to her room and she thought about it. A lake, a storm, something on the north shore that wasn't there before. And 60 years of a story that stayed exactly the same. She had learned from Douglas Fenwick to pay attention to the thing that refused to change. In wood, that was usually where the truth was hiding. The name she eventually found, through careful and patient listening, was Clifton Mass. He was not easy to find. He did not come to town often, and when he did, people spoke to him with a deference that had an edge of discomfort to it. He was somewhere in his 80s, a Métis trapper who had been in these hills longer than anyone else living. He still ran a line in the winter. He lived in a cabin north of the lake that people pointed out on maps and then tended not to visit. She heard he knew things about Shepherd's Hollow. She heard he had known the man who put the secret there. She found him not by seeking him out, but by waiting at the place where his path crossed the road each Thursday morning, on his way to pick up supplies at the hardware. She was sitting on the step of the store, sanding a chair spindle she had brought from the mill, when he came down the road on a Thursday in the 3rd week of October. He stopped and looked at her with eyes the color of creek water in November, clear and cold and very still. She did not introduce herself. She just kept working the sandpaper along the grain and said, quietly, I heard you might know something about the north shore of the lake. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he was going to walk away without answering. Then he said, What are you planning to do with what I know? She thought about that. Nothing yet, she said honestly. I just don't like stories with missing pieces. He looked at her hands. He looked at the drawknife that was laid across her knee, its handles worn to the smooth dark color of old bone. Who taught you that trade? He asked. She told him about Douglas Fenwick. She told him plainly, without sentiment the way Douglas would have wanted. When she was done, Clifton Moss sat down on the step beside her. He looked out at the road for a while, and then he told her about the lake. 60 years ago, he said, a man named Reuben Oak had owned a logging camp on the north shore of Shepherd's Hollow. Reuben Oak had been a hard, sharp-witted man who had built his timber operation from nothing and was not gentle about how he protected it. In the winter of 1962, a supply boat capsized in a sudden squall, the kind of squall that the lake threw at people when it felt like reminding them who was in charge. Reuben's business partner, a man named Calvin Ardle, went into the water with the boat. They pulled Calvin out alive. But 2 things went to the bottom with the wreck: a heavy iron lockbox that Reuben kept his camp ledgers in, and a second box, smaller, that no one but Reuben and Calvin had ever seen or touched. The story, as it lived in Dunmore Creek, said the second box held cash, the payroll for the camp, undeclared income that Reuben had been skimming from the provincial timber lease for years. Money that didn't exist on paper, belonging to a man who had taken pains to make sure it couldn't be proven to exist. Reuben died in 1978. Calvin Ardle moved to Thunder Bay and was not spoken of, and the lake closed over both boxes and held them like a secret it had decided to keep. There is nothing down there, Clifton Moss said. I have dived that lake. Twice. In 1971 and again in 1989. The main wreck is in 20 feet of water, 40 meters out from the north shore. The lockbox with the ledgers is there. Open, empty. Someone got to it before me, or the latch gave and the papers dissolved. He paused. The second box is not with the wreck. Hazel's hand stilled on the spindle. Marilyn Spall saw something on the north shore, she said. Clifton looked at her sidelong. Marilyn Spall has very good eyes, he said. And the storm 2 weeks ago pulled 3 feet of soil from the bank. That kind of erosion, it can move things. He stood up, brushed off his trousers, and picked up his supply bags. I am too old to dive again, he said, and too old to care about the money, if there is any. He paused at the edge of the step. But Reuben Oak's granddaughter owns half this town now. And she has been telling people that lakefront property belongs to the Oakey family trust, and that anyone who finds anything on that shore is legally obligated to surrender it. He said this without inflection. Her name is Patricia Oakey Fenn. She sits on the town council. You will have met her smile already, I think, without knowing whose it was. Hazel had, in fact, met that smile. Patricia Oakfen had come into the hardware the day after Hazel arrived. A well-dressed woman in her 50s with a pleasant voice and eyes that were always counting something. She had looked at Hazel with that smile and asked how long she planned to stay. The smile had not reached the counting part of her eyes. Hazel thanked Clifton Moss. He nodded, once without looking back. She sat on the step for a long time after he left, the drawknife across her knee and the spindle forgotten in her hands. She was thinking about a storm and a dropped water line and something dark on the North Shore that wasn't there before. She was thinking about what Douglas had always said. The truth is in the thing nobody thought to look at. She could not do this alone. She needed someone who could handle cold water, who knew the lake, and who had no affection for Patricia Oakeyfen. She spent another week listening before the name came to her. Isaac Vale. He was the same age as her, possibly a year older, and he worked at the marina on the south end of the lake, servicing outboard motors and fiberglass hulls. He had grown up in Dunmore Creek, which meant he carried the complicated loyalty of a person who loves a place that has not been entirely kind to them. His family had rented land from the Oak Trust for 2 generations and been refused the option to buy it each time they asked. He was a quiet man who did his job carefully and accepted very little from anyone. She found him at the marina, lying under a hull, and she told him plainly what she had heard and what she thought. She told him she had no money to pay him. She told him she wasn't sure what was on that shore or whether it was worth anything. She told him she thought it was worth finding out. He slid out from under the hull and looked at her for a long moment, oil on his hands and a wrench loose in his fingers. Patricia Oakfen, he said, told my father last spring that the family had decided not to renew the land lease. He said it the way people state facts they have already accepted. We've got until March. A pause. I'll need a dry suit, he said, and a light. Give me 2 days to sort it. She felt the same wave of relief she imagined came to people who had been holding their breath for a very long time. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. It's a cold lake. They went to the North Shore on a Thursday before dawn, when the road was empty. The October air was like a blade, and their breath came in small white bursts. Isaac wore the dry suit he'd borrowed from a dive club in Sudbury. Hazel wore every layer she owned and carried the lantern. The North Shore, in the gray light before sunrise, was a different landscape from the postcard version of Shepherd's Hollow. The storm had done what Clifton Moss said, pulled a ragged tear in the bank, exposing raw orange clay beneath the roots of the spruce trees. The waterline was still lower than normal, the exposed lakebed silty and strange and smelling of cold, deep water. And there, half in the water and half out of it, canted against a submerged root, was a shape, dark and rectangular and impossibly solid for something that had been underwater for 60 years. It was an iron box, small enough to carry with 2 hands, sealed with a hasp lock, whose rust was the particular deep orange of very old iron. Hazel stood very still for a moment, just looking. The box was real. The story was real. The thing that everyone in Dunmore Creek had been deciding not to believe for 60 years was sitting in 8 inches of cold water, 12 feet from the bank, resting against the root of a spruce, like it had been waiting for someone with enough patience and enough sense to look at the right moment. Was it the money box? Was it empty? Was it something else entirely? She looked at Isaac. He waded in without a word. Tell us in the comments what you think was inside. And make sure you subscribe, because Hazel's story is just getting started. The moment she opened that box, everything she thought she understood about Dunmore Creek began to come undone. She kept the box between them on the bank, in the dark, while Isaac peeled off the dry suit. They did not open it there. They were too exposed, the road too close, the risk of being seen too real. They wrapped it in the canvas tarp they had brought, loaded it into the bed of Isaac's truck, and drove back to town in silence. He let her take it to her room. She sat with it on the floor of the room above the hardware store for a long time before she touched the hasp. Douglas Fenwick had taught her that you did not force a joint. You found the weakness, and you let the thing open on its own terms. She found a thin blade in her satchel and worked it into the rust at the hinge of the hasp, applying gentle, patient pressure a little at a time. It took her 20 minutes. Then something gave with a sound like a long exhale, and the lid moved. Inside the box, packed in oilcloth that had done its job faithfully for 60 years, were two things. The first was a roll of banknotes, old bills, 50s and 100s, held together with a rubber band that disintegrated when she touched it. She counted them with careful hands. $11,000. A considerable sum in 1962, less transformative in the present, but still real and still whole. The second thing was a document, several pages, folded together, protected by the oilcloth even better than the money. She unfolded them with the deliberate steadiness she brought to everything. It was a contract, dated November 1961, 4 months before the capsizing. It was a land agreement, a transfer of title for the North Shore parcel of Shepherd's Hollow, roughly 200 acres of lakefront property, from the Oak Timber Company to a man named Antoine Moreau, a Métis landholder who had been working the same territory for 3 generations. The transfer was signed by Reuben Oak himself, witnessed and notarized, and the consideration paid was listed as $1 and the settlement of all outstanding claims. A deed, a real and legal deed, for land that the Oak family trust had been claiming as its own exclusively for 60 years. Land that Patricia O'Keefe had been using to deny renewal, to squeeze out families, to consolidate power over a town that had never thought to question the paperwork behind her authority. Antoine Moreau. Hazel turned the name over in her mind. She had not heard it in Dunmore Creek, but Clifton Moss had known Reuben Oak, and Clifton Moss was Métis, and the North Country was not so large as it seemed from the outside. She sat with the document in her hands until the wood stove burned low and the room went cold, and she understood something that had taken her 6 weeks and one very cold lake to learn. This was not about the money. The money was the thing Reuben had been hiding. The document was the thing he had hidden the money to protect. And whoever Reuben Oak had feared, it wasn't the provincial tax authority. It was his own family, finding out what he had given away, and to whom, before the ink had time to matter. She went to Isaac the next morning. She laid the document on his workbench beside a half-assembled carburetor and let him read it. She watched his face go through several things without settling on any of them for long. "Antoine Moreau," he said at last. "Do you know that name?" He looked up. His eyes were careful. "Antoine Moreau was Clifton Moss's great-uncle," he said. "He died in the late 70s. No children. Clifton is the surviving heir." The room was very quiet. "Clifton told me he'd dived that lake twice," Hazel said. "He told me the same thing once," Isaac said. "He said he never found anything." He looked back at the document. Maybe he was looking in the wrong place. Or maybe he decided that finding something wasn't the same as being able to use it. They sat with that for a while. Then Isaac said, "There's a lawyer in Sudbury. Her name is Vivienne Coate. She handles indigenous land claims. She's good." He paused. "If this document is what it looks like, Clifton Mass has a legal claim to 200 acres of Shepherd's Hollow lakefront, including the shore where the box was sitting. Including," Hazel thought, "the land under the Oak family trust's feet." They drove to Clifton Moss's cabin that afternoon. The road north of the lake was rutted and narrow, the spruce closing in on both sides, like they were keeping a confidence. The cabin was small and neat, and smelled of spruce gum and wood smoke, and Clifton was sitting on the step, sharpening a trapping knife when they pulled in. He saw the document before they had finished explaining. He held up one hand to stop them, took the pages, and read them slowly, with the stillness of a man who has trained himself not to react to things until he is certain they are real. When he finished, he set the pages on his knee. He did not say anything for a very long time. A whiskey jack landed on a branch above them and chattered once and flew off. "I knew there was a second box," he said finally. "Reuben told me, near the end. He was not a good man, but he had his reasons for what he did, and he wanted someone to know. He told me there was a document. He told me where to look." His voice was even and dry as creek gravel. "I looked. I did not find it. I decided that was the end of it." He looked at Hazel. "Why did you keep looking?" She thought about it. "Because I don't have anything else," she said honestly. "And because my teacher taught me that the truth doesn't go away just because you stop looking for it." Clifton Moss looked at her hands. He looked at the drawknife on her belt. "Douglas Fenwick," he said very quietly, not as a question. She stared at him. "You knew him?" "I knew of him," Clifton said. "He came through this country 20 years ago, looking for old-growth cedar. We traded some tools." A pause. "He was a good judge of character. I imagine he taught you that as well." Hazel felt something give inside her chest, slow and deep, the way ice moves off a river in spring. The story that came next did not move fast. Good stories rarely do. Vivienne Coate drove up from Sudbury in the first week of November and spent 2 days reviewing the document and the chain of title, and the gap in the Oak family trust's recorded holdings. and she came back with the opinion that the transfer was valid, that the notarization was genuine, and that the case was among the most straightforward she had seen. Patricia O'Keefe, when she was formally notified, did not go quietly. She had a lawyer in Toronto who sent 3 letters before the end of the month, each one louder than the last. But the document was real. The notarization was real. The 60-year gap in the Oki Trust's actual legal authority over the North Shore land was, when examined by people who knew what they were looking at, entirely real. Patricia O'Keefe left a Dunmore Creek Town Council meeting in December without finishing her term. She did not say goodbye to anyone. The town watched her go with the complicated feeling that accompanies the collapse of a thing that was both familiar and wrong. The land, all 200 acres of it, was returned to the estate of Antoine Moreau, with Clifton Moss recognized as the surviving heir. He did not whoop or celebrate. He went home to his cabin and was not seen in town for a week. When he came back, he brought a piece of old-growth cedar that he'd had drying in his woodshed and laid it on the step of the hardware store without knocking. Hazel found it that morning, with a note tied to it, with a piece of snare wire. It said, in the careful handwriting of a man who chooses his words the way he chooses his traps, "For the drawer of the truth." She kept the note. She put the cedar on the workbench she had quietly claimed, in the back corner of the mill, the one Calvin Dre had stopped pretending he hadn't been saving for her. She ran her hands along the grain, feeling for the shape of what it wanted to be. Isaac's family received their land lease renewal in January. The terms were different. Clifton had quietly communicated that the North Shore land under the new title arrangement had no interest in maintaining the Oak Trust's policy of refusal. The document that came through the mail used the word indefinitely in the section on renewal rights. Isaac's father read it twice and then set it down on the kitchen table and did not say anything for a long time, and that silence was the loudest thing in the room. Hazel stayed in Dunmore Creek. She had not planned to. She had arrived thinking of it as a place to wait while she figured out where she was actually going. But something had shifted, the way things shift when you stop forcing a joint and let the thing open on its own terms. She had a workbench and a town that was still figuring out what to make of her. She had a piece of old-growth cedar and a drawknife worn smooth by 2 pairs of hands. She had, in Isaac Vale, a person who showed up when he said he would and said what he meant and had never once looked at her and counted the ways she was a problem. It was enough. It was, she found, more than enough. She had come to Dunmore Creek with nothing but a tool and a skill and the habit of paying attention. She had not expected to find anything beyond winter wages and a narrow room with a view of the road. But the truth was stubborn, and it waited, and it turned out the lake had better things in it than people had decided to believe. We think about that sometimes, the things we dismiss as campfire stories, because believing them would cost us too much trouble. We wonder how many real things are sitting in 8 inches of cold water right now, waiting for someone patient enough and stubborn enough and unafraid enough of a cold October morning to wade in and look. What would you have done, standing on that bank at dawn when the shape of the box first came clear in the lantern light? Would you have reached in? Tell us below. And if you want to hear more stories about the people who reach in when everyone else has walked away, make sure you subscribe to Cabin Stories. There is always another lake. There is always something waiting on the shore.